and it is to some extent recognizable in the New Testament, but it was not apparent in the Hebrew lore of the Old Testament, wherein Satans are seen to perform specific duties of mundane opposition. So, from what original concept or Bible entry was the modern Christian image of Satan born? Welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening. Alrighty, Library of Awakening family, welcome back to another evening read. In tonight's episode, we're going to be diving into another chapter from the Genesis of the Grail Kings, as you guys seemed to liked when we read chapter 1 of Genesis of the Grail Kings from Lawrence Gardner, the astonishing story of the ancient bloodline of Christ and the true heritage of the Holy Grail. Now, Lawrence Gardner has a couple of different books that we've introduced to you guys on the Library of Awakening. Another book that we're going to be getting into in the future, reading a couple of chapters from, is going to be The Bloodline of the Holy Grail, which is another phenomenal book, which leads me over here to What Do I Know's post over on X. She said, "What is the Holy Grail?" and posted this phenomenal infograph, just kind of going into some pictographs of the Holy Grail. Without further ado, let's dive over into another chapter in Lawrence Gardner's Genesis of the Grail Kings. Now, in today's episode, I want to read chapter 10. This one's going to be pretty lengthy. It's about 15 pages. I'm going to attempt to do a speed read through it. So if I stumble on my words, I apologize. If I mispronounce things, I'll stop. I'll try to get the right pronunciation, but I'm going to try to get through this one as quickly as possible. Reading chapter 10 in Lawrence Gardner's Genesis of the Grail Kings. This one caught my eye because of a previous read that we just did talking about the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. So this chapter 10 is titled The Tree of Knowledge, Wisdom, and the Serpent. So let's dive in. Again, if you guys enjoy these evening reads, do me a favor, smash that thumbs up button and subscribe to the platform. We do appreciate the love and the support. These videos do take time to make. It is free to do so. It helps this platform grow, boost these videos out to more individuals like yourselves as we are trying to grow this new platform organically. And it does help. Starting this off, it says, in the book of Genesis 2:9, we are introduced, or chapter 2, verse 9, we are introduced to the central trees of the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It is related that God commanded Adam not to eat from the tree of knowledge, for in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Genesis chapter 2:17. At that stage, it seems that the other tree, the tree of life, posed no immediate problem, but there is no indication as to how Adam was supposed to tell one tree from the other. Eve was subsequently brought onto the scene, and on advice from the serpent, she ate the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Having been informed, contrary to Adam's earlier information, that ye shall not surely die in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good from evil. Genesis chapter 3, verses 4 through 6. It transpired that Eve did not die, and when Adam had also eaten from the tree, the eyes of them were both opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Genesis 3:7. Without any explanation of how these newly created people knew the technique of sewing, the hit hero, all seeing God, then lost Adam completely and called out, "Where art thou?" To which Adam responded that he was hiding. God, seemingly quite unaware of the preceding events, then asked, "Hast thou eaten of the tree?" Whereupon Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent in Genesis 3:8 through 13. At that stage, God was said to be walking in the garden. In the aftermath of this episode, God addressed the Elohim, saying, "Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil." The tree of life then posed a secondary problem. God banished Adam from the garden lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. Not content with this, a revolving sword of fire was installed to prevent access to the tree of life. Genesis 3:22 through 24. But there is no mention of guarding the problematical tree of knowledge of good and evil. The biblical swords of fire are reminiscent of the fire and power of weapons of the Babylonian Enuma Elish. To complete the vindicative punishment, God said to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception, and sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." He also said to Adam that having eaten once from the tree in sorrow, thou shalt eat of it all the days of thy life. Furthermore, although Adam had not touched the tree of life, he was deprived of immortality in any event. In chapter 3, 16 through 22. Thereafter, Adam and Eve became wise with knowledge of good and evil, and for some unexplained reason, God even took up the tailoring role. And did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them? The tree of life, the Kushka or Kushkuna tree, is generally regarded as being a source of personal immortality, but it related more specifically to the immortality of kingship. In fact, the tree of life, sometimes called the plant of life or plant of birth, was directly associated with the office of kingship, its twigs being the shepherd's staff of dynastic investiture, symbolism relating to Adam's denial of immortality, i.e., his denial of the right to a continuing kingship in his own line, was the apparent in the event that the office was not inherited by Adam's eldest surviving son, Seth, but by Eve's eldest son, Cain. What are we to make of all this? Does it relate in any way to the Mesopotamian records upon which the Bible story was based? It does in a rather vague manner, but first we shall consider the nature of the serpent, whose presence has been thoroughly misrepresented for centuries. The biblical term that was used to denote the said serpent was Nahash. However, before the vowels were added, the original Hebrew stem was NHSH or Nesh, which meant to decipher, to find out, or to divine. From the earliest times, the serpent was identified with wisdom and healing. It was a sacred emblem of the Egyptian pharaohs as a symbol of the Essene, the ascetic healing community of Qumran, and has become identified with today's medical institutions. The serpent has never had any dark or sinister connotation except for that imposed on the Genesis text by later day church doctrines. A serpent depiction from the old Mesopotamian is wholly indicative of the emblems of the American and British medical associations, where in each case the serpent is coiled around the tree, plant, staff of knowledge and wisdom. In the ancient Greek tradition, the great father of medicine was Asclepios of Thessaly, 1200 BC, whom the Romans called Asclepios. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. His statue, 200 BC, at the Capodimonte Museum in Rome, also portrays the staff and the coiled serpent. The 18th lineal descendant from Asclepios was the medical teacher Hippocrates, whose Hippocratic oath is sworn by physicians to this day. The serpent who conversed at length with Eve was clearly not a lowly dumb creature, but a guardian of the sacred knowledge. And we know from the Mesopotamian story of Adapa that it was Enki who created him, and Enki who imparted to him wisdom and knowledge. With wide understanding, he, Enki, had perfected him to expound the decrees of the land. He had given him wisdom, but he had not given him eternal life. It is further evident from the Mesopotamian serpent illustration that it has a direct Enki association, since Enki, or Ea, was traditionally depicted as the serpent lord of the Euphrates. Just as the serpent was the giver of wisdom, so Enki was constantly referred to as Enki the Wise, as in the flood story, when he challenged the authority of Enlil by giving Ziuzudra advanced warnings of the deluge, and we talked about this in a previous read. I don't particularly remember what episode it was, but if you go back to the Library of Awakening, we touched on this. I think it was the biblical flood before Noah. This book here, we touched on Zeusudra. Hopefully, I'm pronouncing that correctly. Zeusudra. After the flood, while Enki had been busy working with Ninkursag in her creation chamber, his brother Enlil had been opposed to the embryo scheme. Enlil had devised the flood to get rid of the human problem, but Enki was a true champion of humankind. Since we know that El Elyon, Jehovah, was synonymous with Enlil, the Garden of Eden story is a direct representation of the ongoing feud between the Anunnaki brothers. Enlil was insistent that humankind should be kept in ignorance and should be maintained solely to toil and to bear the yoke of the Anunnaki. But Enki had other ideas. He was hesitant that the black-headed people should be educated. As previously mentioned, Enki and Ninkursag, had successfully created at least 14 of the new humans before they created Adapa and Kawa, Adam and Eve. In the story of the two of these, Elugara and Zelagara, relates that their purpose was to till the soil, to erect buildings, and to serve the Anunnaki for all time in accordance with Enlil's requirement. In the first instance, Enlil endeavored to prevent Adam and Eve from gaining any wisdom beyond their perceived servant status, and he warned them away from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, claiming that they would die if they took of its fruit. Enki the wise serpent claimed that this was untrue and that they should partake of the knowledge. Ye shall not surely die, for God, Enlil, doth know that in the day ye eat thereof. Then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Genesis 3 through 4. In the event Enki was correct, the man and women did eat of the tree, and they did not die, whereupon the disgruntled Enlil announced that the man is become as one of us. Even so, he still imposed his will and sent the Adama to till the ground as a punishment for his disobedience. At that point, the Genesis story of Adam and Eve concludes, to be followed by stories of their sons. But certain non canonical works do follow the adventures of the famous couple. Adam and Eve's original state of nakedness, which is apparently so important to the Genesis narrative, was a reflection of their subordinate status in the prevailing environment, and their covering of themselves had nothing whatever to do with the matters of sexuality. It had to do with the fact that the servants and workers of the Anunnaki were naked in those days, as depicted in the reliefs of the era. When Adam and Eve's eyes were opened, they gained the knowledge of their true station, a station akin to that of domestic animals. Prior to that, they had thought nothing of their nudity, but on becoming aware that they were inferior beings, they were immediately struck with the embarrassment of their situation and sought to rectify the matter. Clothes were a prerogative of the masters, and it is for this reason that the Adapa tablet tells that when Adama was anointed to his priestly station, a garment was commanded for him, and he was clothed. Undeterred by Enlil's attempted interference, Enki had specifically created the earthlings as a leader among mankind, from his own seed, whereas others of the earthly race had been created from the blood of Kingu, Ataba, to give Adam his correct historical name, thus emerged as the first earthly priest king of ancient Sumer in about 3800 BC, and his wife was Ninkawa, or Lady Eve, or Lady of Life. There is an account similar to the Adapa story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which tells once again of the importance of clothing to the enlightened race, as against the nakedness of the standard domesticated earthlings. Here, a temptress says to the naked Enkidu, another created Adama, "You are wise, Enkidu. You are like a god," subsequent to which she marks his new status by providing the man with some clothes. It is commonly believed that the Christian term original sin had something to do with Adam and Eve's sexual behavior, but this is a church promoted absurdity. To the point where Adam is banished from the garden, there is no mention whatever of any physical contact between Adam and Eve. The eventually determined sin was that Eve, a mere woman in the church's eyes, had seen fit to make her own decision, a decision to disobey Enlil in favor of Enki's advice, a decision to which Adam conceded, and a decision which proved to be the correct one. In practical terms, Eve had committed no sin at all because the interdict concerning the tree of knowledge had been placed on Adam alone, which is why only he was exiled. Not until the next chapter of Genesis do we discover that Eve followed in Adam's footsteps, and according to the book of Jubilees in chapter 3:28, they dwelt in the land of Elda. There she fulfilled her wifely function, but it then becomes clear that Eve's first son was not the child of Adam. And because of this, we discover why Eve was ultimately dubbed a sinner by the orthodox religious movements of future times. Before we leave the Garden of Eden, called Edom and paradise in the Greek translation, it is necessary to free our minds of the fearful satanic dogma which the Christian church has attached to the incident with Eve and the serpent. Nowhere in the Genesis account is there any mention, direct or indirect, of Satan's involvement, and yet it has become common practice for the church to portray the serpent as an emissary of Satan, or even as Satan himself. This has been done in an attempt to support the church's self styled concept of Eve's original sin, a concept developed and promoted by St. Augustine, which, like so many doctrines of the early bishops, emerged from an unhealthy sexual paranoia. Not only did the Christian bishops reinterpret the story of Adam and Eve, they also had the story rewritten so that a few verses of Genesis became great biographical books. And it is from the spurious works of fantasy that the familiar portrayals of satanic involvement have emerged. In the Hebrew Bible, as in mainstream Judaism to this day, Satan never appears as Western Christendom has come to know him. The Christian perception of Satan is that of an evil imperialist whose despicable horde wages war upon God and humankind. But this Satan character was an invention of the post Jesus era, a fabulous myth with no more historic worth than any figment of a Gothic novel. In the Old Testament, Satans, though rarely mentioned, are portrayed as obedient servants or sons of the gods, the Ben Elohim, who perform specific functions of strategic obstruction. The Hebrew root of the definition is stn or stn, which defines an opposer, adversary, or accuser, whereas the Greek equivalent was diabolos, whence diabolical and devil, which relates to an obstructor or a slanderer. Until Christian times, the word Satan had no sinister connotation, and in the old tradition, members of a straightforward political opposition party would have been called Satans. In the book of 1 Samuel 29, verse 4, David is himself referred to as a Satan adversary of the Palestines. Whenever a Ben Elohim, Satan, appears in the Old Testament, he is seen as a member of the heavenly court, a member who carries out God's more aggressive dictates. In the book of Job, chapter 1, verses 6 through 12, and chapter 2, verses 1 through 7, for example, a Satan is sent twice by God to tease and frustrate Job, but with the express instruction that he should not seriously harm the man, an instruction which is duly obeyed. In the book of Numbers, when Balaam decided to take his ass where God had warned him not to go, God's anger was kindled. The angel of the Lord stood in the way for an adversary, a Satan, le Satanolo, against him. In Numbers 22:22, in this instance, although performing an instant role, physical obstruction, the Satan was acting for Balaam's own benefit at God's command. By the time of the Old Testament's penultimate book of Zechariah, in 3:1-2, the appointed Satan chief magistrate is portrayed with an independent will, for here we see him in conflict with God in a social matter. In this instance, the Jews returning from Babylonian exile were attempting to regain their family stations in Jerusalem, but they arrived to find a high priest and a governing establishment already in place. God sided with the residential Israelites in the dispute, but the Satan took the side of the desiccated Jews. Nonetheless, despite the political standoff, there is still no indication of anything remotely dark in the character of Satan. The sinister satanic figure, sometimes called Lucifer or Beelzebub or Belial, meaning worthless, emerged mainly through the onset of Christian dualism, the concept of two opposing and equally powerful gods. According to different traditions, Satan was either the brother or the son of Jehovah, or was even the competitive and aggressive aspect of Jehovah himself. In essence, the Jehovah Satan conflict was representative of the ancient pre Christian tradition of the symbolic battle between light and darkness, as perceived by the Persian mystics. The tradition found its way into the ascetic Judaism of sects such as the Essenes of the Qumran, and it is to some extent recognizable in the New Testament, but it was not apparent in the Hebrew lore of the Old Testament, wherein Satans are seen to perform specific duties of mundane opposition. So, from what original concept or Bible entry was the modern Christian image of Satan born? In the Old Testament book of Isaiah is a section dealing with the prophesied fall of Babylon, and referring to the city and its despotic king. Isaiah says, "How are you fallen from heaven, day star, son of the dawn? How are you fallen to earth, conqueror of nations?" In Isaiah 14:12, many centuries after this was written, the image of the fallen day star, Venus, was redefined as the light bearer, and when translated into Latin with the proper noun connotation, it became Lucifer. Hence, Lucifer appeared in this Venus context in St. Jerome's 4th century Vulgate Bible to become associated with an evil Satan some 1300 years later. And John Milton's Paradise Lost, of Lucifer, so by allusion called of that bright star to Satan, Paragon. Today, the Isaiah verse in authorized Christian Bibles retains the Latinized Lucifer entry, which emanated from the Christian Church's creation of its own Satan mythology during the Roman imperial times. The Roman faith was based wholly on subjugating people at large to the dominion of the bishops, and to facilitate this subordination, an anti God, Antichrist figure was necessary as a perceived enemy. This enemy was said to be Satan, the evil one who would claim the souls of any who did not offer absolute obedience to the church. For this scheme of threat and trepidation to succeed, it was imperative for people to believe the diabolical Satan had existed from the beginning of time, and there was no earlier story with which he could be associated than that of Adam and Eve. The only problem was that Genesis made no mention whatever of Satan, but there was, of course, the inherent account of Eve and the wise serpent. The serpent lord was Enki, but in parts of the Chaldea he had been called Shaitan, and so it was determined that the story could be rewritten to suit the desired purpose. The original text was, after all, a Jewish version, and Christianity had become quite divorced from Judaism, even from the westernized Judaism of Jesus. In those days, there was no understandable translation of the Bible available to Christians at large. The Jews had their Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek versions of the Old Testament, while the primary Christian Bible existed in an obscure form of the Church Latin, as translated by St. Jerome in the 4th century. Outside of the immediate Roman Church of the West, there were enthusiastic Eastern Christian branches in places such as Syria, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and it was mainly from these regions where the Jewish competition was stronger that the new Genesis accounts emerge for the Christian market. Among these was an Egyptian Ethiopic work called the Book of Adam and Eve, subtitled The Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, which was produced sometime in or after the 16th century AD. This lengthy book not only features Satan as a central character, but even goes so far as to say that the cross of Jesus was erected on the very spot where Adam and Eve was buried. A Syriac work entitled The Book of the Cave of Treasures is a compendium of earthly history from the creation of the world to the crucifixion of Jesus. It appears to have compiled in the 14th century AD, but the oldest extant edition comes from the late 16th century. Once again, the book introduces Satan as the constant protagonist of evil, setting the scene for the dark and sinister element that flourished in the church promoted Gothic tradition that evolved during the brutal Catholic Inquisition. In one instance, Adam and Eve are seen to be dwelling in a cave when Satan comes 14 times to tempt them, but each time an angel of God puts the demon to flight. The book even maintains that Orthodox Christianity was in place before the time of Adam and Eve and the emergent Hebrews. In this regard, and as previously mentioned, it is claimed that when God said, "Let us go down," he was referring to the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, a concept not established until the Council of the Nice in AD 325. Another volume which upholds this same notion concerning the Christian Trinity is the Book of the Bee, an Nestorian Syriac text from about the year 1222, compiled by Bishop Shalamon of Basra in Iraq. Its title is explained by virtue of the fact that it gathered the heavenly dew from the blossoms of the two testaments and the flowers of the holy books, thereby applying Christian doctrine to the traditional Jewish scriptures, which reinterpreted. If these books can be said to have anything in their favor, it is that their Old Testament genealogies are very much in accordance with the far more ancient Jewish works, such as the Book of Jubilees. Apart from that, they are no more than fictional fables designed to undermine historical record and to intimidate readers into compliance with the dogmatic and sexist rule of the Christian bishops. Their portrayals of Satan are entirely fabricated, and they are contrary to all original Sumerian, Canaanite, and Hebrew archives. Although our familiar translations of Genesis constantly refer to God, it must be emphasized that there was originally no such word or definition in the book. What was used was the general classification of Elo along with Yahweh, or Yad-Ha Vaha, the later of which is traditionally identified as God, or Lord, or Jehovah. However, since the Jews were forbidden to pronounce Yahweh, a customary alternative was Yad Yad. When Abraham promoted the Mesopotamian tradition of Enlil El and Canaan, he was said to have gained access to a uniquely inscribed tablet of ideograms, symbols of concept with nominal expressions, as in some Chinese characters. This was revered as the testament of a lost civilization, a testament of all that humankind had ever known, and of that would ever be known. To the Sumerians, this was revered as the testament of a lost civilization, a testament of all that humankind had ever known, and of all that would ever be known. To the Sumerians, this composition was known as the Table of Destiny, and their history records that the guardians of the table had been Kingu, a son of Tiamat, and Tiamat's great grandson, Enlil and Enki. In the esoteric Jewish tradition, the table was also called the Book of Raziel, a collection of secrets cut into sapphire and inherited at length by King Solomon. The philosophical cipher of the table became known as Ha-Kabbalah, or the QBL, tradition of light and knowledge, and it was said that he who possessed Kabbalah also possessed Ram, the highest expression of cosmic knowingness. The very name Abram or Abram means he who possesses Ram, and the expression was used in India, Tibet, Egypt, and in the Celtic world of the Druids to denote a high degree of universal aptitude. The holders of Ram were the representative masters of eternal understanding, and the identification was evident in such names as Rama, Ramtha, and Aram. In the context of the Old Testament narrative, we see Ha-Kabbalah being passed from Abraham to his son Isaac, thence to Jacob, and so on. From a quite separate root, the Arabic KBL, meaning to twist, came the German word cable, and the English word cable, as in a twist of wire strands. Hence, the resultant word Kabbalah relates to a confusion and is not to be assigned, as it is so often is, to the enlightenment of the QBL or Kabbalah. When really twisted, the extent of intrigue, the emphasized consonantal stems becomes KBBL, whence Kabbalah, which relates to the German word Kabal and the English Kabal. There were, therefore, two distinct movements within the early mystical Judaism. The Kabbalistic movement, the KBBL, reached its European zenith in the Middle Ages in northern Spain and southern France, by which time the true virtues of the Kabbalistic concept were largely forgotten in the West. Certainly in the world of mainstream Judaism, the spirit of Ha-Kabbalah has been almost completely ignored since the 18th century, while material values have prevailed in its stead. Although, with linguists such as Professor Robert Alter, the adepts of Hakabala, including noted present day exponents such as Carlos Soares, have traditionally maintained that our conventional understanding of biblical scripture is a gross corruption of the original writings. Teachings and translations have been structured to conform with customs, beliefs, and politics of the times when taught or translated, and as a result, the original message has been lost in the process. In the bloodline of the Holy Grail, which is the previous book, we saw how this was the case with the New Testament, but the adulteration is rather more pronounced in respect of the more ancient Old Testament. Returning now to the story of Adam and Eve, Ataba and Hawa, Kabbalistic masters maintain that it was not the serpent Enki who was the deceiver, as we are led to understand. The deceiver in this instance was Enki's half brother, Elel Jehovah, or Enlil, who said that Adam would die from eating the fruit. Enki the serpent actually related the truth that Adam would not die from the fruit, and Eve believed this truth. Elel Jehovah had therefore told a falsehood to Adam, who was afterwards enlightened by Eve, and so Adam was not conclusively deceived. In the final event, says Carlos Soares, the only victims of deceit are the readers and recipients of the corrupted interpretation. In the opening verse of Genesis, chapter 4, it is written that Hawa, or Eve, said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. Other variations are, I have got me a man with the Lord, and I have acquired a man from the Lord. The text then continues to say that this new man, Hawa's first son, was Cain, better known by the phonetic translation as Cain. Subsequently, Hawa is said to have given birth to a second son, Hevel, or as we know him, Abel. The Jewish Midrash, meaning inquiry, a traditional commentary on the Bible, emphasizes the point that Hawa's first son was the son of the Lord, whereas the second son was the son of Adam. But in defining the Lord in this instance, Midrash uses the personal name Samuel, thereby identifying Enki the serpent. The name Samuel, Sama-El, derived from the fact that Enki was the patron god of the kingdom of Sama, east of Haran in northern Mesopotamia. It transpires that although the well-known Cain and Abel were the sons of Hawa, Eve, they actually had different fathers. While Abel was the straightforward product of a Homo sapiens sapiens union with Adam, his elder half-brother Cain was an advancement on the earlier cloning experiments with Hawa's ovum, further enriched with Enki's Anunnaki blood. This means that Cain emerged as the most advanced product of the royal seed. Whereas the original Genesis text made much of Cain's prestige and the seniority of his line. These attributes have been demolished by translators and theologians in favor of a secondary descent from Hawa's, Eve's, third son, Seth. In Genesis 4:2, we read that Abel was a keeper of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the ground. By a better translation, however, the text should read more accurately that Cain acquired dominion over the earth, as indeed he did in kingship. When we then read in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3 through 5, that Abel's offerings were acceptable to the Lord, but Cain's were not, we get the impression that Cain's offerings were in some way inferior. But the original emphasis was on the premise that offerings or venerations were acceptable from Abel as the subordinate subject, whereas for Cain to make offerings was unacceptable because of his kingly status. In Genesis chapter 4, verses 6 through 7, it does actually make the point that Cain's seniority over Abel was significant. We then move to the subsequence wherein Cain is reckoned to have slain Abel in the field, Genesis 4, verses 8 through 10. But the word indirectly translated to slew was yakam, and the text should read that Cain, was elevated, raised, or exalted above Abel. The terminology that Cain rose up against Abel is used in the English translation, but in quite the wrong context. Abel was a man conditioned according to his station, time, and location. His blood was therefore figuratively swallowed into the ground. Genesis 4, verse 10. Which is to say that he became so mundane as to be indistinguishable from his toil. The historical significance of Abel, or more correctly, Hevel, is qualified by the name by which he was identified, for Hevel was a puff of vapor. As the short story progresses, Genesis chapter 4, 11 through 16, it is related that the Lord sent Cain into exile as a fugitive. But having said that, the true relevance of Cain's standing is brought into play when the Lord explains that should anyone slay Cain, vengeance shall be taken upon him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any man finding him should kill him. Genesis 4, 15 through 16. What Cain received was not a curse, as is commonly portrayed, but the blessing and protection of the Lord. His father, Enki, Samuel, Cain, then dwelt in the land of Noda, which is to say he lived in restless uncertainty. The question has often been posed as to who the Lord feared might want to kill Cain, given that he and his parents were, according to the Bible lore, the only living beings. This question only arises because of the religious traditions of recent ages. In more recent and ancient times, the Eden symbolism was fully understood in the context of its Sumerian environment. For just as the same reason, many have wondered how it was that Cain managed to find himself a wife in Genesis 4:17, but in a correctly understood historical framework, the answer is self-explanatory. As for the enigmatic mark placed upon Cain, this is probably the most important aspect of the story so far, because although not defined in the Bible, the mark of Cain is the oldest record grant of arms in sovereign history. In the Midrash and Phoenician traditions, the mark of Cain is defined as being a cross with a circle. It was in principle a graphic representation of kingship, which the Hebrew called the Molkat, or kingdom, from the Akkadian word Molka, sovereign. This was a legacy of Tiamat, the dragon queen, and the great matriarch of the Grail bloodline. In the Celtic tradition, the graphic symbol was indicative of the five divisions, comprising four sub-kingdoms with the main palace in the center. In accordance with the history of the imperial and royal court of the dragon, an ancient fraternity with Egyptian origins from about 2170 BC, the outer circle, the mark of Cain, was emblematic of a serpent dragon clutching its own tail, a symbol of wholeness and wisdom known as the Ouroboros. In more recent representations, it is shown precisely in this form. The cross, called the Rosicrucius or Greco-Roman, from Rossi or Rosidu or waters, and crucius, cup or chalice, is a sign of enlightenment, and on this account the sacred Rosicrucius, or the dew cup, or the cup of waters, was the original mark of the foundation of the kingly bloodline. The cup, as identified in the bloodline of the Holy Grail, was itself emblematic of the womb, representing the maternal aspect of kingship, whence the blood royal, the waters of enlightenment, flowed. It was therefore deemed that the Mesopotamian kings were individually married to the mother goddess. As cited by the Oxford Assyriologist Stephen Langdon, ceremonies were actually conducted in this regard. In its female form, the mark of Cain becomes the familiar symbol of Venus, with the cross moved outside the circle so that the woman, the cross, is surmounted by the Ouroboros of the dragon kingship. When set about with the cross above the circle, the representation is that personified by the orb of sovereign regalia. In the tradition of emblematic regalia, the orb signifies completeness, being representative of all things gathered within the orbis. It is also associated with the symbolic eye of the all-seeing, that of Enki, who is called Lord of the Sacred Eye. Given that kingship, or milkot, was perceived as the matrilinear inheritance through Tiamat and Lilith, the name of Kion, or Cain, whence king, was also directly associated with the definition of queen. Although the ion is associated with the all-seeing eye, it is more correctly attributed to blackness or nothingness by alchemists who associate its mystery with the cerebellum, the posterior part of the brain. The all-seeing aspect is that which perceives light from out of the blackness. The very word alchemy comes from the Arabic al, or the, and the Egyptian came, or blackness. Al-Kam is defined as the science which overcomes the blackness, or that which enlightens through intuitive perception. The letter Q, as in Kayan or Kayan, and queen as metaphysically assigned to the moon, and the ku, or q, was perceived as the monthly lunar female essence of the goddess. The divine menstruum constituted the purest and most potent life force, and it was venerated as starfire. Its representation was the all seeing eye, the ayin, whose hermetic symbol was a circle and a period inside of it. The Kamakala of the Indian mystics and the Tribindu of the Oriental school, the letter Q derives from the Venus symbol with the circle and the cross, a symbol equally attributed to Isis, i.e., Ninkersaj, or Lilith, and Kali, all of whom were deemed black but beautiful. The Song of Solomon in 1:5, Lilith and Kali were both titular names, with Kali appropriated from Kala, the periodic time of the female lunar cycle, while Ninhursag, I'm probably butchering that one too. Ninhursag, I don't know if the K is silent. Ninhursag was the ultimate lady of life. Hers was the genius which constituted the true beginning of the sacred bloodline, the genesis of the Grail Kings. In the Rosicrucian tradition, the Genesis has long been identified with the transcendent gene of Isis. Genesis, origin, or beginning, stems from the Greek and from the word genes, meaning born of a kind, whence also derived the words genetics, gender, genius, genie, genital, genre, generation, genealogy, etc. As an alternative, the eye of illumination was sometimes depicted with a triangle and a dot inside, or a period inside, which represented the delith, or doorway, to the light. The modern science of genetics was established by the Columbia University embryologist Thomas Hunt Morgan, who received the Nobel Prize in 1933. His work was founded, however, upon the records of Theodor Heinrich Boveri of Munich University, who in the 1880s explained almost every detail of cell division and chromosomes long before the invention of electrical microscopes. Cain, or Cain, has often been called the first Mr. Smith because the term Cain also means smith, as in metalsmith, or more precisely, as in a bladesmith. It required skill, or kanish, knowing, of the early kings. In this regard, his given name in Genesis, like that of Hevel or Abel, and many others in the Bible, is a descriptive appellation rather than a real personal name. In the alchemical tradition, he was indeed a Kion, an artificer of metals of the highest order, as were his descendants, particularly Tubal Cain, Genesis 4:22, who is revered in the scientific Freemasonry. Tubal Cain was the great Vulcan of the era, the holder of the Plutonic theory of knowledge of the actions of eternal heat, and was therefore a prominent alchemist. Cain's heritage was that of Sumerian and metallurgists, the master craftsman whom we encountered at the court of El Elyon, and the supreme master of the craft was Cain's father Enki, described as the manifestation of knowledge and the craftsman par excellence, who drives out the evil demons who attack mankind. The alchemical pursuits of this family were of the utmost significance to their history, and the expertise of their craftsmanship held the key to the Bible's mysterious bread of life and hidden manna. So if Cain was not the man's real name, then who was he? In Sumerian history, he is referred to as Ar-we-um, king of Cush, the son of Mazda, and the successor to King Ataba, the Adama. Under his alternative name of Masta or Mazdel, Enki, via his son Arwium, the Kion, was the ancestral forebearer of the Magian spiritual master Zarathustra, or Zoroaster. The name Mazda from Masenda means one who prostrates himself as a serpent. And the Sumerian name Arwium is related to the Hebrew word Awam, which denotes serpents. In the Persian tradition, Enki was Ahura Mazda, the god of life and light, who was also called Ormazd or Ormuzd, meaning serpent of the night. While in this context, Mazda is also the equivalent to Lord, Ahura Mazda, meaning wise lord. In the Iron lore of Persia, it was Ormazd who had first created the righteous man, just as Enki was said to have performed this task in Sumer. As to the identity of Cain's wife in Genesis 4:17 through 24, she was called Lulawa, pearl, a lunar jewel. In some Christian works, Luluwa is given as being the daughter of Eve, although she is not mentioned by name in the Bible. Luluwa, or Lulawa more correctly, Lulawa or Lilith, was the daughter of Lilith in the Talmudic tradition. Lilith was Adam's primary consort before Eve. As identified in the Sumerian record, Lilith was the granddaughter of Enlil Elion, being the daughter of his son Nigro, king of the netherworld. Her mother was Nigril's cousin, Ninarash Kigo, and Lilith was the handmaid to her material aunt, Queen Inanna, or Ishtar. Lilith was a purebred Anunnaki stock, and although she was Adam's designated short term partner, the Jewish Talmud explains that she refused to be a sexual mate. Her physical partner in this respect was none other than Enki, and the father of Cain's wife, Lulwa. As mentioned, Enlil's brother Enki in this role, as the serpent, was called Samuel, and in this regard, the literature of the Kabbalah brings us in full circle to where this Eden section began, for it states quite explicitly that Samuel and Lilith are personally referred to as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Alrighty, that chapter was super deep. There's one thing that I do want to full circle back to in a later read via another book that I want to introduce to you guys, and that is this mention of Lilith and how she is of full Anunnaki descent and had a relationship with Adam. We'll get to that in another read in a book that I want to introduce to you guys in the future. As always, remember, non-biased, non-opinionated. I'm not for or against this information. I'm just here as an intermediary, a middleman, a researcher to show you guys that these books exist. What you guys do with this knowledge and this information after you click off this YouTube is obviously, of course, up to you and your own personal journey. I'm just here to show you guys that all these books are readily available at your fingertips inside the private CyberX community. As always, many blessings to you guys. Hope to see you all on the inside. If you enjoyed this evening's read, do me a favor, smash that thumbs up button and subscribe. I know that this was a lengthy one, but all good. We knocked it out. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next episode. I know some of the perspectives that I share may be as challenging for you as they once were for me, but isn't that the beauty of exploration? Every perspective, no matter how unconventional, has something valuable to contribute to it if it's shared. Knowledge is not absolute. It's a living, breathing phenomena, shaped and reshaped over time. The important thing is not always be right, but to always be curious. Explore freely, share boldly, and learn deeply. And don't rely solely on others to validate your discoveries. Stand firm in integrity, even in the face of criticism. Remember that growth always means embracing the humility to admit when we're wrong. Learning from our errors is not a setback, it's the very essence of our progress. So, welcome to the journey. May this space inspire you to ask questions, explore the unknown, and most importantly, to awaken. This is the Library of Awakening.